Hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. So I know what all of you want me to talk about. You want me to be talking about the hostage deal, and I am refusing to do so so far for the a very simple reason. There is nothing but rumors and innuendo and talk, and a lot of it is positioning to try to get the best out of the deal. A lot of it is bullshit. Um, and also it's kind of irresponsible to spread too many rumors about this. Having said that, I do follow all those rumors a lot on Twitter, so follow me there, where I do update what comes out. But there's nothing final and there's nothing that's a done deal yet. So as soon as the deal is finalized, I will analyze it here. Up until then, I may just avoid the topic. What we are going to talk about is something that is also pretty important, which is the American policy towards the Middle East, what some people are calling the Biden Doctrine. So, as we know, a few days ago, three American service personnel were killed in Jordan on the border with Iraq, most likely by drones operated by pro-Iranian militias from that country. And so far, the United States has said that it will respond, but has responded very weakly. And that is a problem. But beneath the surface, and coming up over the surface, the Biden administration has been planning a strategic response. Thomas Friedman, who writes editorials for the New York Times, who I think is quite bad at Middle Eastern analysis, but it's very important to listen to what he writes because he gets the information directly from the Biden administration. He's served as their mouthpiece, essentially. And he wrote an op ed, which you can all read, where he talks about the Biden doctrine. And when you talk about a presidential doctrine in the Middle East, to those of us who have American diplomatic history, it brings to mind some of the grand doctrines of the past, particularly the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was designed to contain Arab nationalism in the Nasser era, which the Americans felt was being developed in conjunction with the USSR, or the Nixon Doctrine, where the US tried to be less involved in the Middle East and allow local policemen, as they put it, to police their areas, like the Shah in Iran and like Israel, and so forth. Those had at least partial success. Then you had spectacular failures like the Bush Doctrine, which was designed to promote regional democracy. At the end of this video, I'll tell you which doctrine this reminds me of the most. Spoiler alert, it's not very flattering. So, why is the Biden administration trying to come up with a new policy? Or it's not so new, really, but a more coherent policy? Because it's facing some serious problems. Iran, backed by its allies, Russia and China, is testing the United States in the Middle East. The entry of Russia and China into this is a very important element that I think will become more important as things continue. Hamas has just asked, as part of the hostage negotiations, which I said I wouldn't talk about, for guarantees from China and Russia that Israel will not attack once the ceasefire is over. That's an example of how Hamas and Iran are trying to bring China and Russia in. And as a side note, just today, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that Russian and Chinese relations are, in quote, their best period in history today, which is probably an overstatement, but tells you how closely those two countries are at least trying to cooperate. And of course, during an election year, the United States has limited room to maneuver against these enemies. It seems that no matter what Biden does, he doesn't get public support. The conservatives accuse him of weakness regardless of what he does, and the progressives accuse him of being genocidal and warmongering no matter what he does. The policies are almost irrelevant here, and that makes it very difficult for the Biden administration to maneuver. Russia and China are encouraging the chains that they're putting on American policy through TikTok and through other social media platforms like X and Facebook. Meanwhile, the war in Gaza, by American estimations, is not going according to plan. They don't believe that Israel is going to be able to land a knockout blow on Hamas, which, at least with the current strategy that Israel is engaged in, is probably true. Uh, so all of this is a problem. The U.S. is caught in a geopolitical vice, and he's caught in a regular political vice with elections going on this year. Particularly, as everyone has noted, he's having trouble in Michigan, where there's a large Muslim population, many of whom are now threatening to vote for Trump or to sit out the elections. But in order to balance against all these problems in the Middle East, the U.S. has tried to create a moderate Arab and Israeli alliance to counter Iran, Russia, and China, but it's been unable to. And it's been unable to a great extent because of the problem of a Palestinian state. Israel has not been willing to declare that it wants a Palestinian state to exist, and a lot of the Arab states are unwilling to draw closer to Israel, especially Saudi Arabia, because of that. So there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of problems to solve, some domestic political and some geopolitical. So the plan that Friedman is talking about, the Biden Doctrine, is designed to solve this, and it has three tracks. I'm just going to quote Friedman here selectively on those three tracks. Track number one would be a strong and persistent stand on Iran, including a robust military retaliation against Iran's proxies and agents in the region in response to the killing of 3 U.S. soldiers at a base in Jordan by a drone launched by a pro-Iranian militia in Iraq. On the second track would be an unprecedented U.S. diplomatic initiative to promote a Palestinian state now, and all three letters in now are capitalized to show the urgency. It would involve some form of U.S. recognition of a demilitarized Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip that would come into being only once Palestinians had developed a set of defined, credible institutions and security capabilities to ensure the state was viable and could never threaten Israel. On the third track would be a vastly expanded U.S. security alliance with Saudi Arabia, which would also involve Saudi normalization of relations with Israel if the Israeli government is prepared to embrace a diplomatic process leading to a demilitarized Palestinian state led by a transformed Palestinian Authority. So there's a lot to unpack there in these three stages. He finishes this overview by saying, quote, if the administration can pull this together, a huge if, indeed, a Biden doctrine would be the biggest strategic realignment in the region since the 1979 Camp David Treaty, end quote. And by the way, the biggest strategic realignment since then was easily the Iraq War, which was probably more important than this Biden doctrine. Anyway, that's quibbling over details. Will this work? Let's look at each plank and tear it apart, shall we? First plank, the resolute American response to the U.S. I think that's a very good idea. I'm just not sure that's going to happen. Iran's responded pretty wisely to this and prudently. What they've done is they've told the Shiite militias in Iraq to stop attacking U.S. forces, and they have in the last few days. Not saying it's going to last, but they're keeping a very low profile. Meanwhile, Iran has been talking to its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Shiite militias, and saying that they're not going to get involved directly in the war, and sending these messages through back channels to the U.S. So what they're basically saying to the U.S. is, don't attack us. We're going to be nice. We're going to be good. That puts Biden in a bind because all Biden wanted up until now was for Iran to um, pipe down and lower the flames. So Iran is saying, here, we're going to give that to you. And that means that if Biden attacks seriously now, he looks like the aggressor. He looks warlike. That undermines him with the progressives. That undermines him possibly with his EU allies. So the Iranians are prudent as always. And they've always been very smart about staying out of the line of fire directly. And that's what they're trying to do here. Most likely outcome from this is orders a big strike, probably not on Iran itself, but on militias and other targets, and calls it a day. As long as Iran doesn't respond. And I don't think Iran will respond because they know that that's the smart place. I don't think this robust reaction to Iran is happening, but I hope I'm wrong. That would help with the rest of the plank for sure. Plank 2 is a Palestinian state. I think anyone who's watching this video is aware of how many problems there are. with the Palestinian state, but I'll break them down briefly. And analytically speaking, I think there's two different levels of problems with the Palestinian state. Not two different problems because there's a ton of problems, two levels of problems. One is the substantive one. The substantive obstacles to creating a Palestinian state are massive. Most importantly, the actors on the ground among the Palestinians don't want this American plan. I'm not just talking about Hamas, I'm also talking about the PA. Because the American plan is to reform the PA. The PA doesn't want to be reformed because if the PA is reformed, that means two things. A lot of the free cash that they're getting from foreign funding will end. They've seen that with what's happened with UNRWA and other funding. And a lot of the corrupt officials who are running things, like Abu Mazen, for example, will be removed because they're corrupt and useless. They don't want that. So the PA and Hamas are cooperating together against this plan. They're talking about having, various coalitions. Maybe the PA will come back into Gaza to some extent, and Hamas will remain to some extent, and Hamas will get some power in the West Bank. They have a shared interest for this not to happen. Iran will do whatever it can to torpedo a Palestinian state, and Israel has some serious reservations about a Palestinian state, some justified, some less justified, some to do with security, some to do with politics. Um, but to an extent, none of this matters. The other level here is the symbolic level. All Israel needs to do in order to get this process started is say that it's committed to a process that may lead to a Palestinian state. That would be a symbolic thing to say. I don't believe, and I'm a supporter of a two-state solution. I think everyone knows that. I don't believe that there could be a two-state solution anytime soon, whether Israel commits to it or not. And even if Israel commits to it, it can later back out. But on a symbolic level, just to make that statement, Israel isn't willing to do that either. And that is mostly for political reasons, not so much for strategic and security reasons, since it doesn't matter all that much. But of course, um, that causes real problems for the rest of the plank, the Saudi element, and we'll talk about that in a second. The U.S. has already begun to put this into action to some extent. Um, Barak Ravid on Axios reported that the State Department is already looking at different ways of recognizing a Palestinian state in the near future. And the United Kingdom, their foreign minister, David Cameron, announced the UK is probably going to recognize the Palestinian state soon as well. So they're moving in that direction. But unfortunately, without an Israeli declaration and without a substantive process, that could just be an empty recognition, which would alienate Israel from the United States and would serve very little. It wouldn't bring us any closer to resolving the problems, to creating this Palestinian state, or to forwarding this Biden doctrine. So just that in isolation will not work at all. Saudi Arabia, as long as the symbolic element isn't happening, is not going to be able to join. They've shown repeatedly that they're not willing to bear the price with their domestic constituency and with the rest of the Arab world of officially recognizing Israel without Israel moving towards the creation of a Palestinian state. It's not clear how far they expect Israel to go in this. Probably not that far in order to recognize, but they need Israel to do that in order to ease the passage of normalization. Friedman correctly says, quote, the three tracks have to be tied together for a Biden doctrine to succeed. And I believe U.S. officials understand this. But there's a final obstacle that is in the way of the Biden doctrine, as if the other ones weren't enough. Biden is not technically a lame duck president. A lame duck president is someone who has no way of getting reelected, either because they're way behind in the polls, because they're not running. Biden is running, and he could win in the elections. It's a long time out. But um, he will be treated to some extent as one, as long as we don't know who will win the next elections. And the polls are not looking good for Biden. And if they get worse, he could be treated even more like a lame duck. And in order to put together a fancy doctrine like this, you need to have political capital, and you need to have the sense from your allies and partners in the world that you're there in the long haul. I don't know how many countries want to join into a Biden doctrine when Trump may be in the White House a little bit less than a year from now. So really, rather than the Eisenhower doctrine or the Nixon doctrine, this reminds me of the Carter doctrine. The Carter doctrine has been forgotten for a reason. What was the Carter doctrine? Well, Carter had a policy of détente with the Soviet Union throughout most of his tenure as president. But in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and his entire policy collapsed. He then tried to put together a tough policy of containment, which involved, surprise, surprise, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt, if that sounds familiar, to try to create an obstacle, a block to Soviet infiltration into the Middle East. Of course, even though the partners had an interest in that, the feeling was that Carter was a lame duck, that he would lose to Reagan, and he ended up losing to Reagan. No one remembers that doctrine. Unfortunately, this sounds to me like that, which is a shame because Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and everyone who's opposing Iran could benefit greatly from this plan. And if there was any sense of continuity in American politics, that if the previous president does something good, the next president will continue it, then this could work. But that's not how American politics works, and that is unfortunate for everyone. And with all the other obstacles, I don't see any of this happening, unfortunately. Okay, now we're going to move to questions. And as always happens when I don't have an episode for a few days, we have a lot of them, and they are doozies. So let's get to it. VPAS asks, since October 7th, U.S. and coalition forces have been attacked by Iranian-backed groups with missiles and rockets on 160 occasions, while the U.S. has responded to these attacks only 8 times. With the deaths of 3 U.S. soldiers by drone attacks on Tower 22 base in Jordan, this is both the first time the American forces have been killed by one such group, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, and the deadliest attack on American troops in the Middle East since the Abbey Gate bombing in 2021. What should the U.S. do in response to this attack? How will such a response affect the current situation in the region? Well, I don't know who you are, DPAS, but that is a very detailed and great question. You should be doing your own YouTube on American security issues, it sounds like. As for your question, so I think that the United States should, and I will be accused of being a neocon warmonger for this, bomb Iran. Bomb Iran directly, bomb Iran aggressively, I would say mercilessly. But what the United States should do is it should bomb a series of Iranian military and government targets, make sure not to hit civilians, um, not take responsibility for it, just be kind of badass quiet about it. That will trigger an Iranian response, but I think that Iran is very sensitive about being hit at home, especially with a volatile domestic situation, and it would not lead to war. I think it would actually long term lead to some deterrence. So it should have a operation within certain bounds that teaches Iran a lesson, because the U.S. has been too weak towards Iran, and I think we all are aware of that and are concerned about it. Agent Smith asks, my biggest gripe with the terms is if there was such a long ceasefire this time, of course, talking about the hostage deal. Why were so few hostages released and a crazy number of security prisoners? These terms could have been had 2 months ago, so what was all this fighting and IDF casualties for then? Hamas is trying to hang on to power here. The IDF needs more military achievements in Gaza, either getting to their leaders or finding the hostages. Hamas leadership clearly isn't feeling the pressure yet. The U.S. is tying Israel's hands on this end. So what gives? Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. So why is Israel going into this deal, assuming it's going into this deal, or at least why is Israel willing to go into a deal that doesn't seem to favor it all that much? Well, I'm not a big fan of this deal, but there are a few reasons Israel's doing this. One reason, possibly the major reason, is immense pressure in Israel from the families of the hostages and their supporters. And that's linked to the second reason. The second reason is the sense that while the IDF operation is going very well tactically, it's not achieving the desired aim strategically. And therefore, time is running out for the hostages. And I think anyone who's following Israeli politics closely understands that this is an internal dynamic. It's also supported by some members of the coalition strongly, like Gantz and Eisenkot. And that's why they're going for this deal. The U.S. wants this deal. They want the war to end, but they're not pushing as strongly on this as they are on, say, a Palestinian state. It's not the thing that they're most worried about. And the U.S. has genuine concerns that if there's a ceasefire and Hamas survives, it will be bad for them. So they're willing to allow Israel to continue to fight, although they'd rather see Israel fight at lower levels. And another reason Israel is willing to do this is because it seems to have decided, unfortunately, not to go into Rafah. It seems to have decided not to take over Philadelphia, at least not fully, and therefore it feels like it has nowhere to escalate to, and it needs a diplomatic end to this. So that's the reason they're doing this. I disagree with it. But it's not the US, it's Israeli policy primarily. The US can't force Israel to do this, and they're for it, but it's not the main thing they're pressuring Israel about. Fred Aaron asks, close friend of the show, of course, whether it is hostage negotiations, military efforts in Gaza, or retaliation against Iran, it seems like politicians in Israel and the US are putting politics ahead of the national interest, to the detriment of the latter. Do you agree with my assessment? Yes, yes, I totally agree with your assessment, Fred. I think in general, there's been more of a tendency in politics to prefer staying in power to the national interest. The idea of politics stops at the water's edge has become very unfashionable. It was always overrated. I think that American politicians um, always looked at their domestic constituencies a lot more than we thought, but now it's more acceptable to say it out loud. On the Israeli end, that used to be less true, especially when Labor was in charge. They didn't really have rivals. They weren't as worried about that. And let's give the early Likud government some credit. I don't think that Begin and Shamir were going around designing their security policies for winning elections. They were men of principle. Um, Begin a little bit less than Shamir, but still. Netanyahu is um, obviously very problematic in this regard. I think he's mortgaged Israeli interests in favor of his survival long ago. I'm not sure his some of his rivals are much better. I don't know if like Lapid would put the national interest first. Gantz maybe has a certain kind of decency like that, but we don't know. He's never been prime minister. I think Biden has done less of that up until recently. Biden has looked at the geopolitics of it, assuming that having a good geopolitical outcome will ultimately be good for his election purposes, which is something that presidents have figured a lot. But now that it's getting to crunch time on an election year, that's starting to creep in. And as for what's happening in the House of Representatives, where aid for Israel is being blocked by Republicans who tied it to a border deal, who then don't want to resolve the border deal, the less said about that, the better. So generally speaking, yes, most actors involved in this on all sides are looking at their constituencies more than the national interest, some more than others. Netanyahu's the worst, obviously. Okay. Atarai J asks, Israelis and Palestinians say that any permanent cessation of hostilities that leaves Hamas in control of Gaza is a defeat with dangerous potential consequences. I'm wondered, feared whether the IDF can oust Hamas from their hardened underground positions, at least at a cost and a time frame that Israel is willing to bear. What is your assessment of whether the mission to defeat Hamas can be achieved? Has your view evolved since the early days of this war? Have your contacts in the military become more or less optimistic over time? Also, do you believe that 3,000 terrorists have been neutralized in Khan Yunis, as some reports have claimed? If so, does that indicate the IDF has regained some initiative? Okay, a lot of questions. I'll look at each one in turn. Can defeat of Hamas be achieved? Yes, absolutely. Hamas can be achieved. It doesn't look to me like Israel has the wherewithal. And when I say Israel, I mean the direct leadership of the government, particularly Netanyahu, to do what needs to be done. I think we all know what needs to be done. Rafah needs to be taken. Philadelphia needs to be taken. A civilian administration of some sort needs to be put in the areas that Israel has conquered. Israel needs to sit there continued to fight Hamas while slowly allowing the civilian administration to expand, thus giving no space for Hamas to operate, no space for Hamas to govern, no space for Hamas to exist until they surrender. That could take ages. It's a very difficult thing to do. Israel doesn't seem to be willing to do it. And if they're not willing to do it, I guess the best thing you can do is find some kind of deal. Has my view evolved since the early days of this war? No. No, I always thought that that's what Israel needs to do. I still think that's what Israel needs to do. And if you'd asked me on the first day of the war if what Israel is doing now would work, I would have said no. Have your contacts in the military become more or less optimistic over time? Well, in terms of the opposition that Hamas is giving to the IDF has been pleasantly surprised, I have to say, at how easily they've been defeating Hamas. They're not happy about the lack of a strategic vision regarding the things that I just mentioned, the lack of a day after plan, a civilian government plan, a plan to take over Rafah, and a plan to take over over Philadelphia. Those things have made them very pessimistic, and therefore most of them at this point see little point in continuing right now and want hostage deal. Although they do want to continue later and hope that they'll be less restrained by the government. Do I believe 3,000 terrorists have been neutralized in Khan Yunis? And does that indicate the IDF has regained initiative? What the IDF is doing right now in Khan Yunis is nothing short of miraculous. They've destroyed all the Hamas brigades there. Basically, overground, there is no Hamas in Khan Yunis anymore. Underground, it's a whole different story. Do I believe that that many terrorists have been killed? Yeah, sure. But lots of terrorists have been killed. I don't know the exact number. Israel totally has the initiative in Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis has been a big success. That doesn't mean so much unless Israel can destroy the tunnels underneath it and can stop them from moving their headquarters to Rafah. I keep coming back to Rafah because as long as Israel doesn't take that, there's a real problem. Final question from Aliyah, also close friend to the show. The UN played a part in creating Israel. Therefore, why is it involved with discrediting Israel? Israel has received the most violations from the UN over any other country, and it created UNRWA, whose top mission is to keep refugee status so the Palestinians can move back. Speak to this. Why is this? Okay, this is an important thing that I think we all need to realize about the UN. There's no such thing as the UN, really. The UN, yeah, you have a UN Secretary General, you have a bureaucracy, they do stuff. UNRWA is a real problem. But generally, all those resolutions you see passed in the UN, it's not the UN passing them, it's the countries of the world passing them. The problem Israel has isn't with the UN. The problem that Israel has is with the international community writ large. The UN in 1948, or 47, I should say, November 47, when Israel was created, was a completely different entity from what it is today. It was divided into Western countries, pro-American and, neutral tending towards pro-American, like Sweden, etc. Soviet-leaning countries, which were far fewer. In fact, the Soviet Union even had Ukraine vote on its own so that it could have another vote. And a few decolonized countries, hardly any. Ethiopia, Liberia, very, very few. Latin American countries were pro-American at that time. So it was governed by the West. And the West was sympathetic to Israel, and Russia wasn't against it either for their own purposes in 1947. That world is long, long gone. Starting in the late 1950s into the 1960s, there was a wave of decolonization. That meant that all the former imperial possessions got independence. Some of those countries were Arab, many of them were Muslim. Those countries created a bloc. They said, okay, the rich countries have different interests from us. Why don't we vote together as a bloc on all these different things, like on trade and like on human rights, very often blocking human rights initiatives, by the way, and like on Israel. The Muslim states said, vote with us on Israel, and we'll vote with you on other things. That bloc has survived ever since. And now there's a constant, permanent international bloc to vote against Israel on just about everything. And the Western countries sometimes vote with them, sometimes vote against them. But the Western countries are outnumbered. So the problem isn't the UN. The UN is responding to what its membership body wants, which is to keep singling out Israel. They're against Israel, the UN bureaucracy, because most of their members are against Israel. If the members were more pro-Israel, they'd be more pro-Israel. It's really about that. And so the UN's not the same thing because the international community is not the same thing anymore. Okay, so with that, we're done here. If you like what I do here, try to support me on Patreon at Shael Media. I recently put out a podcast episode, History of the Land of Israel podcast, on the book of Judges. My next episode will be on the 12 tribes of Israel, so check that out. And I will see you here as soon as there's more news on the hostage deal or something else dramatic and fascinating happens.